Introduction. Good evening, and welcome to the Hearthside Chronicles. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I hope you've found somewhere warm and comfortable. Perhaps you're already tucked up in bed, perhaps you're curled up beneath a favourite blanket, or maybe you're simply looking for a quiet moment at the end of a busy day. This is a place where there is no hurry. Beyond the windows, the rain may be falling, the wind may be wandering through the trees, or snow may be settling softly across the countryside. But here, inside Hawthorne Cottage, the fire is burning brightly, the kettle is warm, and Bracken, our faithful old golden retriever, is already asleep by the hearth. Each evening, as the weather settles outside, we open an old leather portfolio filled with curious maps and forgotten places. Every map leads to a gentle story of ordinary people, quiet adventures, kindness, hope, and the comforting reminder that no matter how wild the weather beyond the windows, there is always a warm light waiting somewhere to guide us home. So settle back, let the fire crackle softly in the background, and allow the worries of the day to drift away. Tonight our journey begins on a lonely little island where an old lighthouse has watched over the sea for generations. This is the lighthouse that waited for morning. Chapter 1. The map beside the fire. The rain had begun shortly after lunch. It was not the hurried sort of rain that arrives with thunder, throws itself against the windows and disappears before anyone has properly noticed it. This was steadier weather, patient weather, the kind that seemed perfectly content to spend the entire day wandering across the hills. By late afternoon, the valley beyond Hawthorne Cottage had almost disappeared behind a soft grey curtain. The fields had faded into one another, the hedgerows were dark, blurred lines, and the old oak tree at the bottom of the garden swayed gently beneath the weight of the water gathering on its branches. Every now and then, a gust of wind travelled down from the hills. It moved through the oak leaves, stirred the ivy against the cottage wall, and sent a fresh scatter of raindrops ticking against the leaded windows. Then it passed, leaving only the steady sound of rain. Inside Hawthorne Cottage, the evening had taken a very different shape. A fire burned in the wide stone hearth. It had been lit before the first drops reached the garden path, because there were certain days when a fire seemed necessary long before the room became cold. Rainy afternoons were among them. The earliest logs had settled into glowing embers. Fresh pieces of oak rested above them, their bark beginning to darken as narrow ribbons of flame curled around the edges. Every so often, a knot in the wood gave a quiet pop. A few sparks rose towards the chimney. The room brightened for a moment, and shadows moved slowly across the oak beams overhead. Nothing else hurried. The grandfather clock stood beside the bookcase, measuring the evening with a calm, deliberate tick. Its brass pendulum appeared briefly through the narrow glass door, then vanished again. Tick, pause, tick, pause. It was a sound that belonged to the cottage as completely as the creak of the stairs or the wind moving around the chimney. Near the fire lay Bracken. He was an old golden retriever with a pale muzzle, large paws, and the sort of deep, thoughtful eyes that made people feel he understood rather more than he chose to reveal. Age had slowed him, but it had not made him unhappy. He had simply become more selective. He no longer hurried towards every sound at the gate. He did not rise merely because someone crossed the room. And he had learned that most household activity could be observed just as successfully while lying upon a warm rug. At that moment, he appeared to be asleep. His nose rested against one paw, and the tip of his tail lay close enough to the hearth to catch the firelight. One ear twitched as rain rattled briefly against the eastern window. His eyes remained closed. The storm, Bracken seemed to have decided, could continue without his assistance. A kettle rested upon the black range in the adjoining kitchen. For several minutes it had been making small, thoughtful noises. It murmured, it clicked. Then, as the water approached boiling, it released a soft sigh of steam. Tea was made in a small blue pot. The leaves were given time to settle, and the first cup was poured into a thick china mug that held warmth well. A little milk followed. Then the mug was carried into the sitting room and placed on the oak table beside the armchair. Steam rose from it in pale, curling threads. The scent of tea mingled with the smell of burning oak, rain-damp stone, and the faint beeswax polish used on the cottage furniture. Bracken opened one eye. The tea did not interest him. The biscuit tin did. It stood on the second shelf of the kitchen dresser and possessed a lid that could not be opened quietly. However carefully one tried, the metal always gave a small scrape, followed by a distinctive click. Bracken had been asleep through stronger noises. He had once slept while a ladder fell against the garden shed. Yet the click of the biscuit tin brought his head immediately from the rug. A plain biscuit was placed on the plate beside the tea. A small corner was broken from another. Bracken accepted it with considerable dignity, chewed twice, and lowered his head again. The room returned to stillness. Outside, water ran along the edges of the lane and gathered in the shallow hollows beneath the hawthorn hedge. Fallen leaves clung to the wet ground in shades of copper, brown, and fading gold. The path to the cottage gate shone in the dim light. No one would be walking along it tonight. The weather had decided the evening's arrangements for everyone. There would be no gardening, no unnecessary journeys, no final errands into the village. No reason to leave the fire. There was something comforting about that. Modern life offered very few evenings when every unfinished task could be postponed without guilt, but rain had always possessed a quiet authority. It closed gates, emptied roads, and persuaded even the most restless people to remain where they were. The cottage seemed to draw itself more closely around the fire. Curtains were pulled across the windows, though not completely. A narrow gap remained, allowing the weather to be seen without letting the darkness feel too near. Through it, the garden appeared in brief fragments whenever the wind moved the branches, wet stone, bending grass, silver rain in the light above the back door. The glass reflected the room as well, the glow of the hearth, the shaded lamp and the shape of Bracken upon the rug. For a time nothing happened. The rain fell, the clock ticked, the fire settled, the tea slowly cooled. It was the sort of quiet that did not require filling. Eventually, a hand reached towards the small stack of books beside the armchair. There were several old volumes there, a collection of country essays, a book about woodland birds, an atlas whose green cloth cover had faded almost to grey. Beneath them lay a leather portfolio. It was broad and flat, with rounded corners and a brass clasp, darkened by age. No title appeared upon it. The only decoration was a small compass rose pressed into the leather. The portfolio had been in Hawthorne Cottage for longer than anyone could say. It had been found many years earlier in the lowest drawer of an old writing desk. The drawer had been stiff with disuse, and when it finally opened, the portfolio was lying beneath several yellowed receipts, a bundle of twine and a single black glove. Nobody knew who had placed it there. Inside were maps. Not the precise, brightly coloured maps sold in shops, but hand-drawn ones made on thick cream paper. Some showed woodland paths. Others traced rivers through villages that had changed their names or disappeared altogether. There were sketches of old bridges, abandoned railway platforms and coaching inns whose signs no longer swung above their doors. Tiny notes appeared in the margins. Good view of the hills at sunset. Bluebells beyond the western wall. Ask at the mill for the narrow path. Some notes were practical, others were less easily explained. A bell may be heard here on still evenings. The ruined gate opens only after snow. Do not cross the stream when the moon is hidden. Most of the maps had no date and no signature. They seemed to belong to someone who had travelled slowly, noticed small things, and never expected the pages to be seen by anyone else. The portfolio was opened, the brass clasp released with a soft snap. Bracken's ear lifted, then settled again. The maps rested in no particular order. A road through a northern forest lay above a drawing of a southern harbour. A map of orchard country covered part of an old city plan. One by one the sheets were moved aside. Then a smaller map appeared near the bottom. It showed a stretch of coastline. There was a harbour enclosed by two long stone arms, a cluster of buildings on the hillside, and a narrow road that disappeared inland between fields. Beyond the harbour lay a small island. The artist had drawn it carefully. Dark cliffs surrounded its southern edge. A landing place had been marked on the eastern side, where the water appeared calmer. At the centre of the island stood a tall lighthouse beside a square keeper's cottage. Lines radiated from the lantern room, reaching far across the sketched sea. Beneath the island, 4 words had been written in faded brown ink. Morning Rock Lighthouse. The handwriting was neat and slightly slanted. It was the only name on the map. No county, no nearby town, no indication of how far the island lay from the coast. Only Morning Rock Lighthouse. The paper had become soft along the folds. One corner showed a faint stain left by rain or seawater. On the reverse was another short note. It could only be read when the page was held near the lamp. The light remained until morning. Outside Hawthorne Cottage the weather strengthened. A gust came down the valley and pressed briefly against the windows. Rain scattered across the glass in a sudden rush. The fire answered with a crackle. Bracken raised his head, looked towards the darkened window and then towards the hearth. Apparently satisfied that the storm remained outside, he turned in a slow circle upon the rug and lay down again with his back to the room. The map was placed carefully on the table. The island seemed very far away. Yet the longer one looked at it, the easier it became to imagine. The rough path between the landing stage and the keeper's cottage. Salt drying white upon the windows. Gulls resting on the roof before another storm. The long spiral staircase rising inside the tower. And above it all, the great lamp turning steadily through the night. 3 seconds of light, then darkness, then light once more. Long ago, before ships carried electronic maps and sailors could summon their position with the touch of a button, the coast had been a darker and less certain place. A harbour might lie only a few miles away and still remain invisible behind rain. A reef could wait beneath the surface without giving any sign of its presence. On nights of fog or storm, a single dependable light could mean the difference between wandering and finding the way home. For more than 100 years, the lamp on Morning Rock had burned above the sea. Generations of sailors had learned its rhythm. They knew that when 3 slow seconds of brightness crossed the water, followed by 7 seconds of darkness, Morning Rock lay ahead. The rocks were close. The safe harbour was farther east. And someone was keeping watch. The final keeper of Morning Rock Lighthouse was named Thomas Harrow. Thomas had lived on the island for 36 years. He had arrived as a young man with 1 suitcase, 3 books, and the belief that he would remain for no more than a winter. Winters, however, have a way of leading quietly into spring. Spring became summer. Summer gave way to autumn, and before Thomas had properly noticed, the island had become the place he knew best in all the world. He knew the sound of the sea beneath every change of wind. He knew which window rattled when the weather came from the west and which stair creaked on cold mornings. He knew where the sea pinks first appeared in May and where the gulls sheltered when the rain became too heavy even for them. Most of all, he knew the light. He knew the low hum of the turning mechanism. He knew the soft click that sounded once during every rotation. He knew the way the beam passed across the cottage wall after dark, appearing for 3 seconds before moving away towards the sea. Thomas never found the repetition tiresome. To him it was as natural as breathing. Light, darkness, light again. On the evening when this story began, rain had been falling since midday. By sunset, the harbour had disappeared behind it. The sea had turned the colour of slate, and a line of darker clouds was gathering far beyond the island. Thomas stood at the highest window of the lighthouse and watched the storm approach. Far below, in the keeper's cottage, his old sheepdog slept beside the stove. Behind him the great lamp waited to be lit, and somewhere beyond the rain a small boat was already making its way towards Morning Rock. Thomas did not yet know it was there. For the moment, he simply rested one hand against the cool glass and listened to the wind gathering around the tower. Then he turned from the window. It was time to light the lamp. Some of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Keeper of Morning Rock. Thomas Harrow climbed the spiral staircase slowly, as he always did. There had never been any reason to hurry. The lighthouse had waited faithfully for more than 100 years before he had arrived, and it had never once seemed impatient. It simply carried out its quiet work, day after day, season after season, asking only that someone should care for it with the same steady devotion. The iron steps curved gently upwards around the great stone tower. As Thomas climbed, the sounds of the island changed. Below him, he could still hear the familiar ticking of the clock in the cottage, faint now beneath the murmur of the rain. Higher still, another sound took its place. The wind. It slipped around the outside of the tower with a low, gentle voice, never quite repeating itself, as though the sea had found a language that only old lighthouses understood. By the time he reached the lantern room, the daylight had almost disappeared. The western horizon still held the faintest trace of silver, but it was fading quickly beneath thick banks of cloud rolling in from the open sea. Thomas paused for a moment before beginning his evening routine. He always paused. It was a habit he had formed many years before, though he could no longer remember why. Perhaps it was simply his way of greeting the evening. The lantern room was almost perfectly round. Tall panes of glass surrounded him on every side, each one polished so carefully that, on clear mornings, they almost disappeared altogether. At the centre stood the great Fresnel lens. Even unlit, it possessed a quiet beauty. Hundreds of carefully cut pieces of glass caught the last of the evening light and broke it into soft reflections that wandered lazily around the room. Thomas often thought it looked rather like a giant crystal waiting patiently for darkness. He smiled to himself. It won't be long now. Outside, the first gulls had already abandoned the cliffs. They knew the weather as well as any sailor. By morning they would return, filling the air with their endless conversations. But tonight, each bird had found its own sheltered ledge somewhere among the rocks below. The island belonged to the wind once more. Thomas began his inspection. He ran one hand lightly across the brass fittings, more from habit than necessity. Years of careful polishing had given them a warm golden glow that the firelight could never quite match. The clockwork mechanism stood ready. Its gears rested silently, waiting for the evening's work to begin. Thomas wound the heavy handle. Round and round it turned. The familiar clicking echoed softly through the tower. He had performed this simple task thousands of times. Not once had it become boring. There was something deeply satisfying about work that asked only to be done well. When the mechanism was fully wound, Thomas reached for the small oil can kept upon a shelf. One careful drop upon each bearing. No more. Too much oil collected dust. Too little invited wear. Old machinery, he believed, appreciated moderation. Only then did he unlock the lantern itself. The wick had already been trimmed that morning. He struck a match. Its tiny flame seemed almost shy against the gathering darkness. For a moment it flickered uncertainly, then it caught. Slowly the lamp brightened. Golden light filled the great lens. The glass awakened. Reflections sprang to life all around the lantern room, dancing across polished brass and weathered stone. Thomas released the turning mechanism. With the gentlest of movements, the enormous lens began to rotate. Light, darkness, light. Far below, invisible beyond the rain, the beam stretched across the restless sea. Somewhere out there, Thomas knew fishermen would glance towards it without really thinking. Captains of cargo ships would recognize its rhythm almost unconsciously. Families waiting at cottage windows in Bellwether Harbour would notice it sweeping briefly across the distant clouds. Few of them would spare much thought for the man who tended it. Thomas preferred it that way. A lighthouse was rather like the village baker. People noticed only when it failed to do its job. He stood watching the beam for several minutes. There was comfort in repetition. Each slow sweep seemed to remind the island that another evening had begun exactly as every evening should. Outside, rain travelled endlessly across the windows. Occasionally a larger gust wrapped itself around the tower, making the glass hum gently before moving away again across the sea. Thomas rested both hands upon the brass rail. He often wondered how many lighthouse keepers had stood in precisely the same place before him. Perhaps 50, perhaps 60. Some would have lived here when sailing ships still crossed the oceans carrying tea from China and wool from Australia. Others would have watched steamships replace great wooden sailing vessels. Some had probably witnessed wars from this very room, seeing distant naval convoys disappear beyond the horizon. The lighthouse remembered them all. Stone has a curious way of keeping company with time. Thomas sometimes imagined the tower quietly collecting every conversation ever spoken within its walls, every cheerful greeting, every lonely evening, every winter storm, every peaceful sunrise. Nothing truly disappeared. It simply became part of the place. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar sound below. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Thomas smiled. Bracken. No, not bracken. Bracken belonged to another warm cottage many miles away. Morning Rock had its own old companion, Sam. The faithful sheepdog had reached the foot of the spiral staircase and was expressing with great politeness his opinion that enough lighthouse work had been completed for one evening. Thomas chuckled softly. I thought you'd come looking. Sam's tail thumped once against the stone floor. There were many things a lighthouse keeper could safely forget. His evening cup of tea was not one of them. Together they descended the spiral staircase. The warmth of the cottage welcomed them long before they reached the kitchen. The fire had settled into a deep orange glow. The black kettle sat quietly upon the range once again. Rain continued to fall beyond the windows, though now it seemed softer somehow, as though the night itself had wrapped the island in a thick blanket of sound. Thomas filled the kettle with fresh water. Sam returned to his favourite place beside the stove, turned twice in a careful circle, and lowered himself onto the rug with a long, contented sigh. For a while, neither of them moved. There was no need. Some evenings are remembered because extraordinary things happen. Others become precious because nothing happens at all. Thomas had always believed the second kind were rather more important. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug of tea and looked through the rain-covered window towards the lighthouse. Its beam continued its endless journey across the darkness. 3 seconds of light, 7 seconds of night. 3 seconds of light, always waiting, always watching, always quietly guiding strangers home. And somewhere far beyond the rain, although Thomas could not yet know it, a small sailing boat was beginning to struggle against the growing wind. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Light That Never Hurried. By the time the old kitchen clock struck 10, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm once more. It no longer lashed at the windows with sudden bursts of energy. Instead, it seemed content simply to accompany the evening, drumming softly upon the slate roof while the wind wandered around the lighthouse with its familiar, gentle voice. Thomas sat quietly beside the fire. His book remained open upon his lap, although he had not turned a page for several minutes. There was something about stormy evenings that encouraged listening rather than reading. The crackle of the oak logs, the quiet breathing of Sam, asleep on the rug, the slow ticking of the clock upon the mantel, the distant comforting hum of the lighthouse mechanism turning above. After so many years, Thomas could recognize each sound without thinking. The lighthouse was speaking to him just as it always had. Everything was well. Everything was working. Everything was as it should be. Then the sound stopped. It was so slight that most people would never have noticed it. The room had not become louder. Nothing had fallen. Nothing had broken. It was simply that one familiar sound, the slow, reassuring murmur of the turning lantern, had quietly disappeared. Thomas closed his book. He listened. The rain was still falling. The wind still whispered around the chimney. Sam continued sleeping peacefully. Only the lighthouse had fallen silent. Thomas reached for his oil lantern. "There we are," he said softly, more to himself than to Sam. "I thought I was missing something." Sam opened one eye. Seeing Thomas collecting his coat, he rose without complaint. Some habits belonged to both of them. Together they crossed the covered passage towards the tower. The stone walls felt cooler here. The air carried the faint scent of sea salt and polished brass. Thomas began climbing the spiral staircase, 113 steps. The lantern threw a warm circle of light upon the worn stone walls. Beyond it, darkness waited patiently. At the top, Thomas pushed open the lantern room door. The great lamp was still burning. Its warm, golden light filled the enormous glass lens exactly as it always had. Only one thing had changed. The lens was no longer turning. Its beam stretched endlessly across one small piece of sea instead of travelling steadily around the horizon. Thomas nodded gently. "I see." He did not sigh. He did not hurry. Old machinery rarely appreciated either. He knelt beside the clockwork mechanism. The gears remained perfectly clean. The bearings still shone with fresh oil. After a moment, he found the cause. A tiny brass pin had worked itself loose, no larger than a matchstick. It rested harmlessly beneath one of the gears. Thomas smiled. "So that's all." He picked it up carefully. The little pin had served faithfully for many years. Metal, like people, occasionally became tired. From a small wooden drawer beneath the mechanism he removed another, almost identical. Every lighthouse keeper kept such things, not because they expected them to fail, simply because one day they might. The new pin slipped gently into place. Thomas turned the mechanism by hand. The gears began moving again with their familiar, contented rhythm. He released the brake, slowly, gracefully. The great lens resumed its endless journey around the room. Light, darkness, light again. Thomas remained beside it for several minutes, simply watching. There was satisfaction in small repairs. Many people imagined that keeping a lighthouse required heroic acts during terrible storms. Occasionally, perhaps, it did. Most days, however, it simply required patience. A loose pin tightened, a window cleaned, a gear oiled, a lamp polished. Great things often depended upon surprisingly small acts of care. Thomas looked out across the sea. The storm had begun to ease. The clouds were breaking apart in the distance, revealing faint patches of moonlight upon the water. As the beam swept slowly across the horizon, something caught his eye. A sail, tiny, far away, almost hidden between the silver-grey waves. He watched quietly. The little boat rose gently upon the swell before disappearing behind another wave. Then the lighthouse beam returned. There it was again. Thomas recognized it immediately. The Silver Wren. Arthur Bennett often sailed farther than anyone thought sensible, not because he enjoyed taking risks, simply because he loved being at sea. Thomas watched as the little boat altered course ever so slightly. Its bow turned towards Bellwether Harbour. The lighthouse beam crossed its sails once more. Light. Darkness. Light again. Arthur had seen it. Thomas smiled to himself. Nothing more needed to be done. Some people imagined a lighthouse guided ships. It did not. The sailors did that. The lighthouse merely reminded them where they were. He remained at the window until the little sail disappeared into the darkness beyond the harbour entrance. Only then did he descend the spiral staircase. The cottage seemed warmer than ever after the cool stone of the tower. Sam barely lifted his head as Thomas returned, apparently satisfied that the night's business had been concluded successfully. He stretched, sighed deeply, and settled himself a little closer to the fire. Thomas laughed quietly. "You always know when everything is all right." The kettle was warmed once more. Fresh tea was poured. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. Only an occasional drop fell from the overflowing gutters. The wind had grown tired. Its voice around the chimney became softer with each passing minute, until at last it wandered away across the sleeping sea. The grandfather clock struck 11. 1, 2, 3. Its gentle chime drifted through the cottage before fading into silence. Thomas carried his mug to the window. The clouds had begun to part. Between them a scattering of stars appeared. The lighthouse beam continued its patient journey beneath them. 3 seconds of light. 7 seconds of darkness. 3 seconds of light. It had been doing exactly that long before Thomas arrived. One day it would continue after he had gone. There was something rather comforting in that thought. Morning came quietly. The storm had washed the sky until it seemed almost impossibly blue. Sunlight danced upon the sea. The cliffs glistened where rainwater still found its way back towards the waves below. Gulls filled the air once again, calling cheerfully to one another as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Just after breakfast, Thomas heard the familiar sound of a small engine approaching the landing stage. He stepped outside. The silver wren was easing gently alongside the old wooden jetty. Arthur Bennett climbed ashore, carrying a paper parcel beneath one arm. "Morning, Thomas." "Good morning, Arthur." "I thought I'd call in." Thomas smiled. "I rather suspected you might." Arthur looked up at the lighthouse. "I could see your light all night." Thomas glanced towards the tower. "It did what it has always done." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "It did more than that." He handed over the paper parcel. Inside was a still warm loaf from Bellwether's bakery. "My wife insisted." Thomas thanked him. The two men stood quietly for a few moments, watching the sea sparkle beneath the morning sun. At last Arthur spoke again. "Funny thing about a lighthouse." "Oh?" "Most nights nobody gives it a second thought." Thomas looked towards the turning lantern high above them. "But on the nights that matter," Arthur smiled. "There's nothing in the world quite so comforting as seeing that light." Thomas said nothing. He simply nodded. Some thoughts were complete exactly as they were. When Arthur sailed back towards Bellwether a little later, Morning Rock became quiet once more. Thomas carried the fresh loaf into the cottage. Sam was already asleep beside the stove. The kettle had begun to sing. Outside, the sea stretched peacefully towards the horizon. Above it all, the lighthouse continued its faithful work. Never hurried, never late. Always waiting, always watching, always offering a quiet welcome to anyone searching for the way home. And perhaps that is why, even now, whenever rain falls gently against the windows and a fire burns warmly in the hearth, some people like to imagine there is still a lighthouse somewhere beyond the mist, its steady beam moving patiently through the darkness, reminding every traveller that home is never quite as far away as it first appears. And of Episode 1.